This is the Art of Darkness podcast with Kevin Kautzman.
And Brad Kelly. We're a couple of very online writers interested in the dark side of what drives creative people to create against all odds.
This show is about art and the people who make it, what it costs them, and what it takes to bring something unique and impactful into the world.
Each episode, we excavate the life and work of an artist you might think you know.
Don't worry, they're all safely dead.
On every episode, we try and find out just what the hell was wrong with them and how they worked through their darkness to create something that lives on after them and continues to move culture.
Find us online at artofdarkpod.com and on Twitter at artofdarkpod.
And welcome back to the dark room. This is the space where we bring a friend along for the journey, have a conversation about a subject that we've already covered. In this case, the Marquis De Sade. But before we get into this, Kevin, how you doing?
I'm great. I'm ready to marquee my territory here with you.
Marquee your territory.
Very excited. I just came up with that. I had no planning, just right off the top of the dome. Yeah, I know.
That's
spitting.
why you get the big bucks.
Yeah. How are you, Brad? How are you?
I'm doing really well, man. We dropped the Cormac McCarthy episode, came out yesterday, so that's been fun. And I'm deep into researching the life and work of Fela Kuti.
All right.
Which
next core episode coming up soon.
Yeah.
All right.
So that'll be fun. That'll be a lot of fun. So for people who know, people who've been following along with us, earlier this year we did an episode on the Marquis de Sade, French writer, notorious. I don't even know. There's a lot of adjectives and that you can give to the man.
I'll tell you one thing. He was definitely a marquis. We know that much.
We know that.
Yeah.
We got that nailed down. So
right there in the name.
Yeah, it's obvious. If you want to get the full deep dive on who that guy was, his life story and his various crimes and contributions, go back and check out that episode. But for this, I
just gotta say real quick, Brad, that episode is paywall. So
that's
you
true.
You gotta go behind the paywall for that. But in any case, please introduce our guest here, Brad.
Yeah, so for today we are joined by James Martell, Associate Professor of Romance Languages at Lyon College. He's the author of Modernism, Self-Creation in the Maternal, The Mother Son, and editor of Samuel Beckett and the Encounter of Philosophy and Literature, editor of Tattooed Bodies, Theorizing Body Inscription Across Disciplines and Cultures, and editor, for our purposes of most relevant, editor of the forthcoming book, Understanding Sade, Understanding Modernism. James, welcome and thank you for sharing your time with us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Brad. Thank you, Kevin, for the invite. I'm really excited to be here. And I'm just like, let's talk Sade for Le Marquis.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I guess first, obviously you've done a lot of work in a variety of writers and a variety of ideas. What for you is the attraction of Sade? Maybe not attraction. What is the interest in Sade? Why is that something that you thought, oh man, I really need to actually spend some time and we're going to put together a book on Sade? What's the motivation there?
Oh, that's a great question. It's strange, right? Because, when I was younger, at some point you start getting attracted by these like more transgressive authors, right? Mm-hmm. So you like Sade, you like Georges Bataille, you like, Nietzsche up to a point and so on. And obviously, Sade has this fame of being like the worst of the worst. Like if you really want to, read something outrageous that is going to like transgress, all the boundaries of things, especially like I grew up in Mexico. So like I grew up like Catholic, right? Mm-hmm. Like then I, saw the light or whatever you want to say it and became pretty agnostic atheist. But like in the French tradition, right? Like it's also like a Catholic country regionally. So Sade is pretty out there in that sense. So that was the first thing that attracted me. I remember I read it during a trip in Europe, one of those backpacking trips, right? When you're in your 20s, with a girlfriend at a time, like just, in a like motel in Belgium, just reading like the 120 days. So that was the first thing, obviously, and it was exciting and so on. But, at 20 something, I didn't understand the significance of it. It was like, this is interesting, but that's it.
Mhm.
Then I became, and I'm known as a Samuel Beckett scholar. That's where I work for the most part, right? Together with French philosophy. And then Beckett had like a connection with Sade because he was part of what is called the Sade boom of the 20th century, right? We began with Apollinaire and the Surrealists, rediscovering the Marquis, which, you know, his texts were lost for a while, right? And then through that, like Beckett even was supposed to translate Sade. He was one of the jobs as like when he began, like, you know, as a poor writer, as most of us can be, like that was a way of making money. And he, very savvy at the time, he was like, maybe he admired the Marquis for some reasons. And our book actually has 2 chapters that deal with that connection, Beckett and Sade. But he was worried that will, like, you know, affect his reputation.
Sure. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, because
That's,
being connected. Yeah.
Yeah, we were a little worried it would affect our reputation, to be honest.
Well, I was worried too.
Yeah.
Right? But something that I think, like, and this happened, you know, recently, that also made me get back into Sade was, one is that a couple of years ago, and I was trying to find the exact date, but I think it's like a decade ago or something, the French government bought the manuscript for the 120 Days of Sodom, right? Like, which is this crazy, if you guys like Google the image and see a picture, this crazy role that Sade had, and it's this like tragic, well, yeah, comic tragic story, right? Like that he had it and then he lost it, and then he died thinking that his like major opus was lost, right?
Yeah.
But
right. He said he cried tears of blood over the loss of it, right? Yeah.
There you go. Yeah. But the fact that so to me it was interesting as a French scholar that the government will invest in this, right? Like, and kind of like legitimize in some way the role of Sade in this tradition, right? And for all of us who watched the inauguration of the Olympics in Paris, right, and Gojira and all the blood, you know, we got to think like, oh, there's something in the French tradition that is inherently subversive, right?
Sure. Yeah.
Right.
That's true.
Yeah. So then there's a scholar called Stanley Gontarski who used to be a friend of Beckett and is a friend of mine, and he runs this collection of Understanding Modernism.
Okay.
And one day in a talk, he was like, hey, like he just said, like, you know, to nobody in particular, he said, I wish somebody will do it on Sade. And I was like, I'll do it. Like, I was like, you know, why not? And then that's how I got into it. But it's been like, then the thing that really happened, and I think this goes more to the question of why for me, was that, you know, I've seen this, I thought, like, ever since, you know, not to get hyper political, but ever since like 2016, like I kind of realized that something was changing in the culture around us, right? And it made me, exactly. It made me think, like, you know, what are these dark forces and where are they coming from? And it made me study the famous crisis in masculinity, right? Like I was like, I need to understand how this is happening. And then, you know, looking at and my introduction and my chapter in the book going a little bit into this, right? Is like the closest characters that we have to the Marquis characters, especially in the 120 Days, are sort of like, you know, Jeffrey Epstein and his friends.
Well,
right? Like,
yeah. I reading 120 Days, I thought like, man, this is what Epstein maybe would have wanted to do, right? Like, you know, it's a little hyperbolic in the setup, but like, this is in Epstein's head for sure. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. And then the other side of it was this kind of tendency that we have at the same time in America right now, where, you know, some people are kind of like wishing we had a monarchy or some kind of like king, right? Which makes it very interesting comparison when you look at what was happening with Sade, you know, because he's so famously, right? Like he was accidentally and sort of not during the French Revolution, right? Like the anecdote that we all love about him yelling at the Bastille, like they're killing us, and that's why made people go in, like even though it was a couple of days before,
but it wasn't, but it wasn't true, right? So like, there's that they were killing people, in the Bastille, Yeah.
Yes, no, it was, but like it goes to this like So I'm not a trained like 18th century guy. I'm a 20th century. So
Fair enough. Yeah.
yeah, you guys might know more about this than I do.
Yeah.
But like in my research for the book, understanding like the causes of the revolution, right, which are debated still today. Like it's like a huge
Sure.
thing, like right, like it's not this official history, but the part of like Sade's movement and category as you guys were saying, like he's a marquis, right? So as being part of the aristocracy, kind of part of the enlightenment, right? Part of the cultural milieu that was exerting pressure, but also like this dark character, right? Like it makes him like this symptomatic like the events that it's in some way like it's really a good, you know, like not where you can understand the revolution and where we can understand like what interests me to me at the end, that is, you know, he might be very rough to read and obviously like violent and so on, but the drive for emancipation that he has, it's still kind of very relevant, right? In different
Yeah.
ways, right?
Yeah, no, I got that in doing the research for our episode. I really did start to understand that Marquis is sort of like um the French the Revolution, incredibly complicated historical event, and some of it is kind of lost in the translation through time to some extent. And of course, we're reading it from different sources, and history is, you know, history is a lot of half truths, right? Documented history, so you're trying to piece it together. But he does come across as this like encapsulation of the whole thing, the complexity of it, the hypocrisies of it at times, the like innate drives underneath it, and sort of from both sides, like you're saying, this sort of like um uh or orgasmic desire for freedom, but also he also represented the nobility too, and that, you know, it's not like he was some genuine egalitarian. I mean, he may have said that he was, but in his personality, he wasn't, right? So yeah, he does kind of represent this, you know, if you want to understand the French Revolution, you read about his life and you've got a decent look into it, it seems. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, right. And like one of the main contradictions that like, you know, signals exactly what you're saying is how for all the, you know, gory, absolute extreme violence of his writings, he was against the death penalty.
Right.
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 And
That's very
when
interesting.
right, and when the revolutionaries come and get him, and they're like, you know, as the movie that you guys recommended was like showing a little bit of that really well, about how the king had this power of the lettre de cachet, these letters to like imprison people like as a decree, right? And that's how he got there. Like, well, besides some crimes that he committed, but
Right.
but like when they were like, hey, like, you know, these guys you know, one reason he didn't get decapitated was because he was seen as a victim of the aristocracy as well, right? And when they were like, hey, you know, your mother-in-law is the one who got you here, so like we can go and get her and like, you know, choppy, and
right,
and he right, and he was like, no,
yeah,
he was like, no, like because his egalitarian impulse was like, a man can kill another man, that's fine, but the state should not do it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
So,
And
yeah.
and that is actually a very that's a significant philosophical distinction in my opinion. Yeah. I mean, it is two different things, right? Yeah, that's, and I was impressed. I was fascinated by that part in his life story too, when it all kind of comes down, and his mother-in-law, from his perspective, had not done well by him, right? She had conspired to get him thrown in prison in Sardinia and a variety of other things. And then, yeah, when it came down to it, he didn't do it. Yeah, very, very, very interesting. So, you know, I think there's, I guess, so obviously there's like relevance to the French Revolution and understanding the French Revolution. And I think there's a way to see, I don't think somebody has to know that much about the French Revolution to understand the relevance of that historical moment to now. I guess, you know, in terms of these compiling these essays for this book, what was were you trying to, you know, cover a lot of different ground and go into a lot of different areas, or is there a sort of um, a more connected thesis between all of them? Can you tell us a little bit about, how you went about pulling these essays together? Do they hang together in a way, or are you kind of all over the place? Tell us a little bit about that.
Sure, thank you. So that's a good question too, because the book, it belongs to a series. The series is Understanding a Philosopher, Understanding Modernism, right? And the question of modernism, is it's part of the debates that, for like at least two centuries we're working on. And it depends a lot on the country you are talking about, right? So like one of my esteemed colleagues at Lyon here, he's an American modernist, right? And I'm a transatlantic modernist, sort of. And we have barely anything in common, like in terms of theory, right? Like we love each other and drink beer, but in terms of theory, like it's very difficult. So the series has from understanding Derrida, understanding Badiou, understanding William James, Deleuze, like a lot of philosophers, right? And so I was that's part of it from the series editors, and that I wanted to do myself because I collaborated with that series before, was we need to illuminate the relation with modernism, right? Like with modernity and with modernism, like the two things, right? So in that sense, that was one task that I tried to do, and I think we managed to do it really well. The thing with Sade too is that, so your traditional quintessential scholar of Sade is going to be a scholar of 18th century, right? And they tend to be sometimes very historicist, and they're great. And we have like Mladen Kozul, is a great scholar on that, and he illuminates beautifully the relation between Sade and Rousseau, and that's fantastic, right? But then there is the other people who are, for example, more into surrealism, right? So one of the most, if you guys haven't read it or seen it already, one of the most important recent books on Sade is Sade and the Avant-Garde by Alice Mahon. And it's a fantastic tale of how the surrealists, and especially female artists, grabbed Sade and created this what she called the Sade Imaginarium to free a lot of again, the emancipation of desire beyond certain constraints. And it's interesting because it has more or less feminist perspective, right? And because surrealism, I don't know if you guys have noticed already how it's coming back in some ways. Right?
I feel like I'm living through it at times. Yeah.
That's a good point. So we sadly Alice couldn't write for the book. We tried, but people reference her book a lot because it's one of the most important ones right now. But also, for example, wanted to have literally a book of just dudes talking about Sade will also look pretty bad.
That's
right.
Fair.
So we needed another perspective, and we got these great scholars. One Cindy Zeiher from New Zealand, and Fernanda Negrete from SUNY Buffalo, who's the director of the Psychoanalysis and Culture Institute there, to write on Sade and write on what the Sade tells us, right? And both through the perspective of psychoanalysis, which is also very big for Sade studies, because Jacques Lacan, the famous French psychoanalyst, right, wrote this Kant with Sade to explain the similarities between the Kantian projects, right, of the Enlightenment, and Sade's own project, right? So we got those chapters, and they I say in the intro to the book, understanding Sade, understanding modernism is not for or contra Sade. It's more facing Sade, right?
Sure.
I'm facing it as a mirror. This is us, right?
You don't necessarily have to have an enthusiasm for him or his work to recognize that there's a reason why the name comes up 300 plus years later, right? So right, absolutely. That's what we were trying to do with this conversation in our previous episode too, is what the hell is what the hell is this whole Sade thing? We're not talking about, there's not that many other writers from the 18th century that are still commonly there's more than zero, but there's not that many that people are commonly talking about, and he's one of them. So definitely, I feel like we do need to face him in a certain sense.
And I think especially when you talk about the 18th century, right? When we think about how we are still grappling with the inheritance of the Enlightenment, right? As for one progressivist version of the story, which they say oh, we reached Enlightenment, it was great, we enlightened the Dark Ages, and then we got to the Industrial Revolution, and everything's great.
Right. Yeah. Right? And then everybody will have jetpacks, and nobody will die of cancer.
Yeah.
We're like, well, exactly. Hold on, that's not how it went, is it?
Exactly. Because you guess the other one, and we have an article talking about it, which is the Adorno and Horkheimer version of that ended up in the Holocaust. Right. Because because Enlightenment is based in the logic of identity and in subjects that define themselves for this pureness, right, of the human, and that means exclusion, and it's a very complex story. But it made people read Sade as the obverse of the Enlightenment, right? So it's Lacan being one of the guys, Lacan saying, if the Enlightenment's ethics of the categorical imperative and so on, have these yes, everything's gonna be great, we're just gonna become, like Fukuyama, the end of history, where free market will save us all. Then it's well, what is that based on? And it's in this repression and violence of colonialism, sexism, and so on, right? So in that sense, it's the contradictions in Sade that we were talking about are interesting, right? Because he shows that hypocrisy. He's it's all about power too, right?
Yeah. He's the shadow. He's the shadow of Enlightenment, I guess, right? Yeah. That's pretty interesting. Yeah. Huh. So, and maybe there's a way to kind of dovetail into this. So, one of the things on this show that we try to do is, we talk about mostly writers, because Kevin and I are writers, but a variety of artists. And, we talk about some who have life stories in which either reprehensible things have happened to them or they've done some reprehensible things. And we tend to believe in separating the art from the artist. That is, you can read a book by a terrible person and it doesn't make you a terrible person, right? You can enjoy the music.
You can listen to a podcast from terrible people and it doesn't make you a terrible person.
Right. But with Sade is my biggest challenge when it comes to that. And I'll sort of tell you why this is the case. It's because he did things that I can't get behind in his life. And as I read his life story, it didn't seem like he was even, a lot of people of his class were doing similar things at the time, right? He's not that much of a outlier in terms of the actual sexual deviance and things he was, inflicting on people. But nonetheless, it's documented. We know that. And then the writing at times overlays onto what he was doing in these sort of crimes that he's committed. And so there's something in which it feels like here is an exaggerated version of that. If a serial killer, and I'm not saying Sade is a serial killer, but if a serial killer was writing books about murder, was writing novels about murder, it would start to feel kind of icky. And I get that ick a little bit with Sade. And I don't know if there's a question in here, but I guess my thinking, what I'm trying to get at is can we separate Sade from the man from the work, or is he like this counter argument to the idea that you even can separate an artist from the work? What do you make of I guess what do you make of this, separating the art from the artist, and specifically in the case of Sade?
I think that's an amazing question, right? And it's so vivid to how our ways of reading have changed, and of consuming culture in general, right? Even for me, remembering 20 years ago, to now. I think you're right. I think the example of the serial killer writing is not that, out of there. It's good. I think, I agree with you. I think we need to separate, the artist sometimes from Picasso, right? Picasso was a womanizer, right? And Hannah Gatsby has made amazing, points about this, right? But he's still one of the most liberating artists of the 20th century and so
Mhm.
I think with Sade, it's not the same, but it's a little bit like with the issue with Mein Kampf and Hitler, right? Like, which
Mhm.
is it's banned for ages in many countries, right? Particularly Germany, obviously. And a couple of years ago, which when I say couple, usually it's like 10 or 20 because I'm old to forget, but a couple of like, a decade ago or something. I don't know if you guys
Mhm.
remember. They decided to finally made it like available against to the audience, right? To the public.
Mhm.
It's like we are going to allow Mein Kampf to be like published, but how is it going to be published, right? And the edition that exists is like this gigantic, like hyper scholarly, that shows like exactly where, where are the lies, where are like the manipulation, and like it's if you're gonna read it, like you can't just read it like enjoy it, like hey, it's great. It's like no,
Right.
like this is a
It's got
scholarly
all
document.
this. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think with Sad, there's something a bit about that in the sense that you need to contextualize him, right? I think and this is a little bit more my personal kind of like opinion on these things, but it's like I think Sad is not as dangerous because he's like in your face, like like he says, I want to write the most horrible story of the history of literature,
True.
right?
Yeah, he's not trying to trick you into it. Yeah.
Yeah, right,
Yeah.
right. Well, I think like violence that, for example, I think like movies that like, or books and so on that like keep normalizing certain behaviors of oppression, right? In subtle ways and like tropes of sexism or homophobia or transphobia and so on, in subtle ways are more dangerous, right? Because you consume them as like oh no, this is normal, right? Like
Right.
it's fine to you mock somebody from being gay. It's fine to like tell women that they can only do these things or others. Like I think when it's like more subtle, like those products are more dangerous to me than a guy
Interesting.
that is gonna tell you like I'm gonna like sad, like I'm not gonna lie, like it's hard to read.
Yeah.
But sometimes I tell my wife, sometimes she's like, oh my god, you're reading this again, and I'm like,
Yeah.
it's pretty funny. Like it's just so outrageous, right?
Yeah.
Like that at the same time, like at the end of the 120 days, when it's like you get this character that is like the devil and he's like gonna cyclically like rape everybody. You're like,
Yeah, it gets a little it does get ludicrous and it does become kind of funny at a
yeah,
certain point. Yeah. If you can like wade through it to
yeah.
get to some of it. Yeah. Yeah.
But I do agree. Like when I began, this is the first time I write something. I wrote in college some one or two things, but it's the first time I published something on SAD. And when I started, I gave a talk in India online, but in a university, and I saw like I got a lot of people like trying to like befriend me on Facebook, and I was like,
Yeah.
okay, like I was like, usually
Yeah.
that doesn't happen, but whatever, great. And I did get like one or two that I was like, they were like messaging me questions, and I was like, I think you're too much into it. Like this
Right.
is
Right.
right. Like I'm
There
not a
is like
fanboy.
yeah, Sod is one that there's like a line you're like, yeah, you might be too you could be a person could be too into the Marquis de Sade, that's for sure.
Yeah, and if it's like if it's your kink and everything is consensual, it's like more power to
Sure.
you.
Yeah.
Like I was in the goth scene when I was a kid, and we were like with some like friends in the BDSM scene and so on. So all of that is like we're all adults, so it's fine. But like there is, yeah, exactly, like when it's like some takes that is like it's like people who like Nietzsche, for example, right? Like Nietzsche is a wonderful author, but it's one of those that is so complex that you really need like I needed experts to help me with Nietzsche, right? Like myself. So like that's kind
Yeah.
of the same thing a little bit. It's like how are you taking it? But at the same time, like I I don't think it's like like a question of there's no canceling sad, right? Like it's
Well, yeah. What are you gonna do? What are you...
well, and also because it's part of our that's a part of the mirror, right? It's like we all have drives, right? Like we all have this kind of like we have to like coming from the European tradition. I think that in America we sometimes don't question our relation to desire as much as the French culture does.
Okay. Yeah.
Right, and I think like French writers like Marguerite Duras or even Beckett himself, like they do question Annie Ernaux, like who won the Nobel recently. They do question a little bit of like why do we desire, how do we desire, how violent it is, right? And I think that
Mhm.
in that sense, it's a good thing to question. And he's done carefully. Like it's it's. I think I don't think he's an amazing writer, as in like, oh, his style is so beautiful.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
it's not
Well,
like
it isn't, but I did, as I was reading, I spent I basically I read bits and pieces, and then I read 120 Days of Sodom all the way through is what I've read of Sod essentially. And I started after I sort of there was a sort of a breaking in period where I had to like adjust to like, okay, this is what I'm in for. And then after that, I did start to think a couple of things. One is that the man's sexual imagination is out of this world. Just the scenarios you can concoct just from an imaginative exercise is pretty impressive, as depraved as the scenarios can be.
Brad's been watching my home videos again. I was like, did the DMs leak again? Go on.
But then the other thing is 120 Days of Sodom in particular it's a brilliant piece of satire also.
Yeah.
Even structurally how it's arranged, the characters that are involved, the level of control that they're trying to exert, the various character types that they represent within this sort of the first estate and the second estate within the ancient regime and all of that. It's sort of brilliant. Like we kind of joked in our previous episode that he could have accomplished that satirical task with maybe 30 Days of Sodom. Like maybe it didn't have to be 120 to make that point. But this is where I suppose he gets kind of interesting. It's like, okay, it seems like on one level he's satirizing, he's making satire, but on the other you can tell he's also enjoying the sexual fantasy of it on some level. So it gets to be this point of like, can you satirize something by showing them doing something that you would enjoy doing, or does it stop being satire? Like I kind of got spun around like, is this satire, or am I just reading it as satire? I'm not even sure at some point. I guess that's the question. Do you think is he satirizing the nobility, the upper classes, that sort of thing?
That's a great question, and a great take. I think and you're making me realize something very interesting here, right? I think we have in general this tendency to believe that writers, and you guys are writers, so you're gonna really understand this point. I think, like that, writers, or we writers, if I include myself, like that we're in control. Like it's like the fallacy of intention, right? Like intentionality. It's like when my students, I teach basic like or lit introduction, right? And they're always like what does he mean? What does she mean? And I'm always like, it's not about what they mean, right? Like they might not know what they mean. Like part of writing, right? Is letting these forces, like the unconscious. I'm psychoanalysis guy, so sorry, right? Like
no, I totally agree with you. I'm about to finish writing a book. I have no idea what I meant by
right. Exactly.
It's just I had to like it's like I'm on a ride more than anything, right? Yeah.
And exactly that is the case. I think like he might have. I don't know if satire was his intention. I think his intention was as you're saying, like, I mean, he's kind of getting off. Like, yes, that's completely like,
he's in prison. He's there's
no Pornhub. Like, this is how he, use your imagination. And it's part of his erotic procedure. But also, I think he's mocking them, but also as like, we are all like that, right? Like I think your point was really good when you said like, yes, he did. Famously, he supposedly tried to poison some folks, but it's like the biographical details say that it was more like good old Viagra and didn't work out, or it was some kind of like. And then like he did abuse like a servant for sure. Like that's kind of like the most like on the record that is there, right? But I think your point. I mean, this doesn't justify it, but your point is like dead on. It's like, who didn't? Like they all were like the movement of the Libertins in France wasn't Saddam friends. It was a huge movement of like power, and that's why I went to the Epstein and Trump and Bill Clinton, right? Like when you
Yeah.
have the power, like you're gonna do it.
Well, that's a big part of what the French Revolution was even about, to my reading, was the fact that the commoners came to see these people not only as sort of economically taking advantage of them, but as morally bankrupt at the same
Yes.
time. It was both at once. And Sade is an example of that. But we found that his father wasn't his father definitely was a libertine and took some liberties with people. His uncle was an abbey and he would like keep young girls in his living quarters and things like that. And then there was a time where I'm forgetting, I don't have it directly in front of me, but there was a time when he was under the guardianship of this other guy who was, I don't know if he was a marquis. I apologize, I don't have it at my hands, but another member of the nobility. He was living in the house. Sade, as a boy, was living in this guy's house, and this guy would just, for fun, would shoot day laborers on the estate, and just that's how he got his kicks. So like, it's not, Sade wasn't even like a black sheep. He was sort of, he's almost like the guy who got caught in a way.
Well, yeah, and then like if you go a little further back in time, right? I don't know, you guys have talked about like Gilles de Ré, right? Like Gilles de Ré was this like other aristocrat of the time of Joan of Arc, right?
Okay.
And Gilles de Ré is famous because he fought with Joan of Arc at some point. Like even the movie with what's his face? Luc Besson did this movie in the 90s with his wife at the time, Mila Jovovich, right? And Vincent Cassel, the French actor that sometimes shows up in Hollywood. I think he's in Black Swan, right? He plays Gilles de Ré as this young soldier fighting, because he was that. But then Gilles de Ré later, when he retired to his property and so on as an aristocrat, famously, like, kids start disappearing around the area, right?
Right.
And then
I've heard about this,
yeah, like Foucault, the French philosopher, has a book which is The Process of Gilles de Ré with all the documents, where it's like, it's these kids, like hundreds of kids start disappearing, and at some point it's so much that they have to get him, right? Like he's like, oh, you did it once or twice, that would have been fine, but you are decimating the population, my guy. Like, so they sentence him to death, right? So like, and that's like centuries before,
right?
But it's still like, part of like in my research, right? It's like these kind of fantasies of absolute sovereignty, right? The sovereign that has the right of exception on its subjects, right? The king being the biggest figure for a state, right? But in those older times, you had like realms, right? So this is like the mayor of your town got the right to do whatever they wanted, right?
Right.
So in that sense, like, I think that's another reason why it's interesting to read him, because like I'm giving a presentation on it, and I did already before, but where I talk also about him and this kind of like the Sadean sovereign subject in relation to characters like Andrew Tate right now, right? Who present themselves as this like hyper masculinity, like pure, like all the women are at my desire, right?
Right.
And it's like, that's so like, in order to understand like who we are, like do I want to know about Andrew Tate? No, I wish my brain didn't wasted like brain cells on that.
Fair enough.
Right, but we have to, right? Because our kids are watching this, and
he's a figure. He's out there. Lots of people listen to him. To pretend he doesn't exist, is doesn't do anybody any good.
Exactly. So and I think that's why Sade is interesting in that sense too, because like it's again, some parts are hard, like like do we want to face the fact that desire involves possession? No, like it's sometimes we want to forget it, but it's it's part of how it happens. And it's not that we are like, oh my God, you read Sade and you're like, oh boy, it's me. Like, hopefully not. But you recognize, like, and that's why the voices of like different scholars that we had in the book is really interesting, right? Because, like, for example, Negrete, she says something like, like there's one of the things that I would recommend people to read from Sade if they want to begin with is the philosophy in the boudoir, right? Like, it's a very interesting piece because it's funny, It has this kind of initiation. It's outrageous, but it also has a political pamphlet and so on.
Mhm.
But it's about the education of a young girl into like liberation and sexuality, right? And one of the chapter that my friend Fernando Negrete did is like, it's not saying this is wrong. It's saying it's just not enough, because there are forms of liberation and desire that SAD doesn't include. And like, and they start getting close to some current conversations in France about, for example, why do we, pay too much, like you circumscribe sexuality to penetration, right? Like, why do we circumscribe sexuality to dominance, right? Like, so it's kind of like they're saying like it's good that SAD is liberating you, but then from there you can like actually liberate yourself further from the stereotypes that he has.
Okay.
Right. Yeah. And that's a challenge, right? It's like, it's like you get out of certain prudery if you want to from here, but then you realize that he still has these stereotypes that if we want to, really think of new forms of loving and desiring and caring about each other, I'm gonna do like a plug for a friend here. There's a writer called, you guys might know her, Maurice Meyer. She has this great, she has this great article in the, I think the LA Review of Books, and it's called "How to F Your Neighbor," and it came out around the time of the Mr. Rogers kind of thing. And it's fantastic. You guys should read it. It's about that. It's about like no, we have just not gotten far enough, right? Like
interesting.
Yeah, it's like maybe the kinkiest thing is to actually be open and vulnerable, right? Like that is, and care for the other. Like that's dirty. Like let's do it. Like
right,
kind of
right. Well, yeah, I think
I'm gonna go out on a limb and tell my neighbor Jim that's not happening.
Sorry, Jim.
I love my neighbor Jim. He's a good guy. We share lawnmowers when we need to, but that's about as far as it goes.
I'll loan you a power tool.
Yeah, right. Yeah, he did clamp his. We did try to charge my battery recently here on my family wagon. But James, I'm following. I make light of it, right? But I'm following what you're saying. It's very interesting, deeply philosophical stuff here. All from this, like the sort of the dirty mind of this man trying to occupy himself in prison. It's fascinating. Yeah,
it's one of his big motivations. Yeah, and it does make me think too, like. I don't really know if I'm able to formulate this very well, but there is something about, so, everybody has sexual desires to some extent. Basically, most people do have sexual desires of some kind. And everybody's is a little different. They're a bit like fingerprints, right? Everybody's is somewhat different. And there is something about totally clamping down on those completely that it will tend to come out in negative, destructive ways, I think. There's probably a way where if it's completely let out with no consideration, no thought, no sort of guidance, no whatever, that's probably also negative too. But I guess there is something about, if one can be sort of honest and vulnerable about them, maybe you can express it or get your needs met without being destructive, somewhere in the middle, right? Like, because I think there are certain ways for sure that everybody's sort of sexuality has been, they've gotten the signal that it's inappropriate, it's not right. They're a dirty little boy for thinking that or whatever, right? And that didn't do us any good necessarily. But then you do get like the Andrew Tate thing, right? Which in some ways might be a deep down response to that. Like, no, fuck you. You can't tell me that I'm wrong. So yeah, that's interesting. There's some kind of, it's a more granulated look at all of this. Yeah, I've got to meditate on that a little bit. Yeah. I had one other question I wanted to ask you, because I read, you shared a bit of the book. You shared the parts of the book that you'd written, the 2 chapters in the introduction. And thank you for sharing that. Very, very good stuff. I'm looking forward to the full volume. I wanted to ask you a little bit, because I don't know if I totally understand it. And this is kind of taking things in a different direction. Something that you posed as the Sadian question, which is, can one eat the sun? And
Oh yeah.
help me understand this like as a philosophical concept, as a question. I mean, I guess first, where does that come from? Eating the whole concept of eating the sun, and then what are these sort of philosophical implications of that?
Oh, so I trained as a philosopher, so stop me if I like you guys are getting bored, please.
Yeah. Okay.
So there's many like things to it. Like we can go to like Louis XIV was called the king's son or the sun king, right? Le roi soleil, right? So there always have been this idea of the analogy between the king and the sun, right? Because they give the light to the realm and sun, right? Which comes traditionally in philosophy with like you go back to Plato and the world of ideas, right? So the biggest of the ideas is the idea of the good, right? And from the idea of the good, right, which is kind of what later Neoplatonism will make God, right? Spreads everything into like this participatory like ontology, right? Like the farther you are, the worse you are, right? Which also goes to like if you read Dante's like Divine Comedy, right? Like God is like the sun, and like the paradise is nothing but like looking at it, right? And bathing, like enjoying its light. Plato will say you can't look at the sun, obviously, right? Like no disrespect to our former president during the eclipse, but yeah, like exactly that's the point, right? Like don't look at the sun, because it will blind you. Like you cannot see, light itself. Exactly. So and at the same time, there's the absolute, hyperbole, right? Like the sentence from Sade is a character that says, like, I wish I could attack the sun, right? Attaquer le soleil, right? Which is this hyperbole of like, you want to transgress everything, right? Like Sade, as you guys have read here and there, like in the different works, right? Like it's very clear that one of the things he gets off the most is transgression, right? Like he's not a 100% atheist. Like he says that he is, and his characters get really angry about it. But like if they really were like, I don't come from, I'm not from the US, and for me, like in French and Spanish, to saying I'm an atheist just means like I just don't believe in God. It's pretty chill, right? But there are atheists that are more aggressive, and they're like, no, I don't believe in God because he doesn't exist, and I need to show people that like I don't care that much, right? But Sade, and his characters, they care, right? Like they need to reaffirm like there's no God, and then sometimes when they are like in ecstasy, they're like, and if there was, I will kick him right now, like
Right.
So it's part of this idea of like you want to transgress the laws of the state, the laws of the neighbor, but also like you want to transgress like God himself, and the sun will be kind of like at the time with the Enlightenment, you had like theism as kind of like the new religion, right? Which was just like this idea of a God that is not Catholic, is just one. So I think that's one figure that he's trying to do, but again goes with this kind of absolute sovereignty, right? Like this, like I'm gonna like be so the greatest of the greatest that I can do that, right? The metaphor of consumption is interesting too, because in philosophy, right, it's one of those things about and one of the philosophers I work the most, and besides, so I do Beckett, but the other thing I do is Jacques Derrida. That's my guy. And Derrida talks a lot about how do we face the other and otherness, right? And how do we face the other respecting them and not trying to assimilate them to what we think they are, right? So like when we like facing the other means like allowing the other to still remain other to you, right? Not being like oh, I understand you and I know what you are, either because you are gay or black or Latino. Like it means like I wanna leave a space of non-understanding because I don't share your experience, and that space is good ethically.
Okay, right. That makes sense. Yeah.
So Sade and this like tradition of the sovereign is the idea of like, no, I'll eat the other, and right, and the metaphor sometimes becomes like real, right? Like there's a lot of cannibalism included, right? Which again goes back to the like notions of desire as well, right? Like the metaphor of like eating the other is one of the most sexual metaphors we have, right? Like in many languages, right? Yeah. And obviously you want to eat the other in a way that you're not hurting them and they're still there, right?
Right.
But I think that's part of what the metaphor is doing, and I think part of what I try to do with my own piece on, because it's mostly my chapter is on Derrida and Sade a little bit, and Derrida notices a lot of the there's no better word to say it, like the coprophagia going on inside, like a lot of
there's a lot.
There's a lot, right? Like
some might say too much.
Some might say too much, yes. Right? But it's this idea, right? Like it's not only you are gonna absorb the best of the best, like, which in those ideals is like the purest virgin that they can find, right? Like the 12-year-old kid that is super religious and so on, right? But it's also about like you also can consume the worst of the worst. And when you do that, also, I think it comes with this notion of nothing escapes you, right? So, like, and to end the philosophical aside here, right? There's this dialogue that is very famous in philosophy, is the Timaeus of Plato, right? And in the Timaeus, it's a cosmology, right? Like they describe the origin of the world. And it says that at the beginning, there is this, like the world, the universe, right? The cosmos is an animal that is perfect and round, right? And it says it doesn't need food because what it excretes, it consumes.
Oh, okay. So it's like self-contained entirely.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the idea, right? It's like when you are this kind of absolute sovereign, like when you don't need other people, that's the point, right? Like Andrew Tate again saying like, I don't sleep with vaccinated women. I don't do like, I don't need you. Like what they're saying is like, I don't need anybody. I'm the self-made thing, right? When you don't need anybody, right? Like then you don't need to express anything. You are like on your own self, like, consuming thingy. And I think that's part of the metaphor there is like this idea of, right? Like I am the best. I'm a self-made man. I'm like, like,
yeah.
You can go to nationalisms there too, right? Like America first.
Sure. Yeah, we don't need anybody else. There is something interesting about the Andrew Tate thing, which is there is the sort of I don't need anybody else attitude, but then like, well, why are you talking all of the time? There is a little bit of that. Like, you seem to need a lot of attention for one reason or another. What's up with that? I say as somebody who's also needs attention. So, but there is something in that the eating the sun thing too, which I think builds on this, which is it being about the sun. It's also by destroying the sun, you're destroying like all sustenance, right? So there's this just notion of like I guess it is this sort of ultimate, you don't need anything. But then also, I think about the sort of older ideas about, eating one's enemies, that you somehow gain their power too, right? So not only do you not need the sun, but you have now absorbed its power to some degree. Yeah, it is a powerful metaphor, and I feel like when I was reading 120 Days, I kind of read right over it, and it didn't really stick with me. But in reading your piece, it really got me thinking. So thanks for talking about that more. Go ahead.
I was just going to add, like, the reason why it got me is because there was an exhibit at the Musée d'Orsay in Paris on Sade. It was the first exhibit in the giant museum, and they call it to eat in the sun.
Oh,
like that
okay.
was they picked it. A writer who just died. Her name is Annie Legrand, one of the main Sade scholars and writers. She curated that. You can watch the video on YouTube.
Oh, cool.
And I have the catalog around there with my books. And so it wasn't. I'm just like trying to not to take credit. Like it was the museum who was like, this is the metaphor to do the first giant exhibit of the Marquis de Sade at one of our national museums. Yeah.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, we'll look for that. I guess, I should plug, I didn't do this, for our Patreon supporters and our Substack supporters, we're gonna, of course, bring James back for another bit, 20 to 30 minutes, and we're gonna talk about a few things, but the main thing we're gonna talk about is this crazy 1989 film just called The Marquis. That is, it's a highly fictionalized version of a part of the life of Marquis. It's not very historically accurate, though there are aspects of it are sort of metaphorically accurate in a historical sense. But it's pretty wacky. I mean, the Marquis is wearing a dog mask, the masks are actually quite good. But everybody in the film is a different animal. A main character in it is the Marquis's penis, whose name is Colin, who he has regular conversations with. There are claymation sequences. It's a hoot. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. It's a fun little cultural oddity. I kind of enjoyed watching it. It's funny, at least, and it's interesting as a kind of a cultural artifact. So we're going to talk about that. James, I guess before we kind of close it down here, where can people find you? And then tell us about, when Understanding Sade, Understanding Modernism is coming out.
Sure. Understanding Sade, Understanding Modernism is coming out in January of next year. Most of these books tend to be, the scholarly books tend to be very expensive at the beginning because they go with the hardback and they are like academic. If any of your audiences are in universities, I would say just ask your library to buy it. Don't buy it yourself.
Sure.
But then later, we hope that this is going to be a rather successful one, especially for academic standards. So hopefully a cheaper version will show up. And people can find me on Twitter if they want to follow somebody wacky. Otherwise, shoot me an email if you anybody has a question or something. Always glad to, talk literature and culture with people.
Awesome. Yeah. I guess I do, now that I know that you're a Beckett guy. So we've had an episode on Beckett. Kevin, you got any Beckett questions? I want to ask a Beckett question, but I was
just off the cuff. Well, no. So James, you're a Beckett scholar. You mentioned earlier that Beckett was fearful of the association with Sade. Was that how much of that had to do with Beckett's own Irishness, or was it more general than that? I mean, one wonders. I mean, if that might have played into it, because of course Ireland, is rather famously parochial, shall we say?
Yeah. That is a great question. Thank you for that one. Honestly, the parochialism of Ireland, it just pissed Beckett so much. He hated it. So his letter, he's like, "You country bumpkins, you gotta stop." So because of that, I wouldn't think I don't think there was any. I think it was more like a young writer trying to make a career of himself, and at some point realizing, that might, because he was writing in big journals already, like Le Temps Moderne. He knew Sartre, he was part of that milieu. But at the same time, he had not published yet the trilogy and Waiting for Godot, which are the things that made him, right? So he was still struggling to get his things published up to a point. I think it was more this a
tactical choice, right? Maybe we're not gonna go that far. I don't want to be associated with the De Sade name at this point.
I can sympathize with that.
I think even myself, when people are like, "You're the sad guy," I'm like, no, I do other things.
No, I'm not the De Sade guy. I wrote,
right. Yeah. Well, and let's talk a little bit more Beckett on the After Dark, Brad. So again, for the dumbs and the subs and the doms and the dumbs and the ums and the ahs, you know where to find us. We're patreon.com/Art of Dark Pod, and then on Substack, it's the same thing. You can't miss it. Brad, thanks for organizing this. I always enjoy talking with somebody like James. Clearly, James, you got a lot of ideas, very philosophical, but also a literature appreciator like we are. So, Brad, we're going to come back on the After Dark.
Yeah, absolutely. That was fantastic. Thank you, James.
Really good, guys. Okay, I'm going to take a quick shower. I'll be back.